This is Block 8, Pax Americana, Section 6, the Seeds of the Civil Rights Movement, with the section on Earl Warren. Earl Warren was the 14th Chief Justice of the United States, and he served from 1953 until 1969. The Warren Court is probably the second most, he is, I can't even say probably. He is the second most important Chief Justice in American history. The only Chief Justice more important was John Marshall, who established the principle of judicial review in the first place. Earl Warren, appointed by Eisenhower, people expected to be a fairly moderate conservative, turned out on the bench to be a sweeping doctrinaire progressive, and he moved the court in a very progressive direction and transformed many areas of American law and American life forever. That the Supreme Court had always been the third of the three branches of government. But in 4 landmark decisions, Chief Justice Warren made the court equal with the President and the Congress, and some people would say that he turned the Supreme Court into the most powerful branch of government. We're going to talk in quite a bit of detail about Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954, which ended school segregation throughout the country, but also in Gidgen v. Wainwright. Justice Warren said that state courts have to provide legal representation for the accused. He said in Reynolds v. Sims in 1964 that state legislatures had to agree with the principle of one man, one vote, that rural conservative areas could no longer be overrepresented in state legislatures. And in Miranda v. Arizona, he came up with what everyone knows today as your Miranda rights, that those accused of crimes had the right to be made aware of all of their rights by the arresting officer of the police. And anyone who's ever watched Law and Order knows what those rights, as enumerated by Chief Justice Warren in Miranda v. Arizona, are. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, the state will appoint you one. All of those law and order things that you all know, those are your Miranda rights. Those were invented and put into law by Chief Justice Warren. Like we said, although he was no conservative, he extended the reach of the law into areas in which it never previously had been. Things that previously had been the purview of the legislature, things that previously had been the purview of the executive, things that previously had been the purview of the states or of local communities, now the Supreme Court of the United States had a say, and a powerful say, and a say that no one could argue with in those previously democratically minded areas. Gunnar Myrdal loved Chief Justice Warren. If you remember, Gunnar Myrdal said that the American democracy could never solve racial problems, and that progressives in the United States and around the world applauded and celebrated Chief Justice Warren overruling and overriding the will of the people as expressed in Congress and the presidency to imprint and to implant his view of what the United States ought to be on the land. The most important case that he ever decided, and the most important case of the entire 20th century, was the case of Brown versus the Topeka Board of Education. In 1954, this seminal case overturned unanimously the separate but equal doctrine of Plessy v. Ferguson, and said that separate schools by definition were inherently unequal. That even a separate school for whites and blacks that had exactly the same textbooks, exactly the same facilities, exactly the same everything, the very fact of their separateness defined them as unequal. Chief Justice Warren goes down some new paths in judicial thinking during the Brown v. Board of Education case, that Chief Justice Warren started taking social science into effect when deciding matters of law. This was a huge departure from what was traditionally assumed to be the function of a judge. That it was traditionally assumed that the function of a judge was to apply the law, and the law alone. The law in its majesty was the only thing that could possibly guide a judge. Well, Chief Justice Warren went beyond that. His supporters said it was great that he went beyond that, and his detractors said all he was doing was stamping his personal preferences on his own decisions. But he made extensive use of social science. Most famously, black students that had gone to black schools were more likely to look at white dolls and think that they were kind, and that they would look at. There was a famous experiment, and the experiment went that young black students, young black children, were shown images of white dolls and black dolls, and they associated all of the good qualities with the white dolls and not the black ones. And this led people to believe that the very fabric of American education was leading black people to dislike themselves and to assume that white people were superior to them. And Chief Justice Warren used social science like this to arrive at his judicial decision. And he arrived at the decision that separate was unequal by definition, and he ordered schools throughout the South to integrate, to desegregate at all deliberate speed. Now, the border states, states like Missouri, Kentucky, Tennessee, Maryland, made good faith efforts to comply, that they worked very hard to close down their all-black schools and to integrate their white schools and their black schools, their white students and their black students. And lo and behold, the world did not end when white kids sat next to black kids in classrooms. But throughout the Deep South, through the heart of the old Confederacy, most schools were still segregated years after the 1954 decision. That although Chief Justice Warren had ordered from the bench of the Supreme Court schools to desegregate, it was still up to local officials to do that. And local officials, I can promise you, had no love for Chief Justice Warren, and as events were to show, without being forced to by the powerful hand of the federal government, these states, towns, counties, municipalities would very often not desegregate without some incredible federal pressure being brought to bear. And that's what happened at Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. In September of 1957, this high school, Central High School in Little Rock, got a direct order that it had to desegregate. The governor of Arkansas, Orville Faubus, decided that absolutely not. He was going to ignore this judicial order from a federal court. He was not going to force the high school in the capital of Arkansas to desegregate, and to enforce his views, he ordered the state's National Guard to guard the school and to prevent these 9 black students from attending classes. We were set up in Little Rock, Arkansas for a clash between the power of the state of Arkansas and the willingness of the federal government to enforce its own laws. General Eisenhower, who was president at the time, President Eisenhower, is forced into action. Eisenhower did not like the Brown decision. Eisenhower, not that he didn't like black people, Eisenhower thought that the Brown decision usurped the power of the other branches. Eisenhower thought that when the American people were moving slowly towards the idea of racial equality, and that racial equality would only really come into play when American legislatures and presidents voted for it, not when it was enforced and sent down by edict or by diktat by the Supreme Court. So Eisenhower did not like the Brown decision, not because he didn't agree with it, but he did not like what the court was saying about its power versus the other branches of government. Despite the fact that Eisenhower did not like the decision made in Brown, he could not have a governor of one of the 50 states threatening military force to prevent a federal court order from being imposed. This is a direct challenge to the authority of the federal government. You want to make a similar, it's like the Whiskey Rebellion in 1790. President Washington could not handle a direct threat to his authority as president, to the authority of the government of the United States. Eisenhower is in the same exact boat. This is a direct challenge to federal authority. As is his power under the Constitution, he removed Arkansas' National Guard. He removed it from Governor Faubus's power. He federalized it. He put the Arkansas National Guard under his personal command as commander-in-chief. He sent other National Guardsmen from other states to join the Arkansas National Guard, which had been federalized, to escort the students to class. And here we have a picture of it. You can see this this student here, up here, enduring the taunts of that white girl behind her, yelling probably some pretty nasty things at her. And you can see down in the picture at the left, here are American troops sent in by General Eisenhower, escorting these 9 students to their classes. It is a seminal moment again in American civil rights that for the first time in a long time the federal government is going to enforce in the South its policies and its rules concerning racial equality. That for a long time, from the end of Reconstruction until now, the federal government had ignored its own laws. It had not enforced its laws on equality in the South, leaving them up to the states. The states obviously did not enforce them, and Jim Crow was the result. By the middle of the 1950s, and this 1957 decision by President Eisenhower in particular, the federal government was going to use all of the power at its disposal to enforce its own rules concerning desegregation and racial equality.